which is kind of a pretty amazing story from theory to impact on the real world. And usually when you think about cryptography, you think about a bunch of tools. That is encryption or public key encryption. How can you communicate with someone you have never met in privacy over the public channels in the presence of someone who may be an adversary and want to listen to your conversations, digital signatures, zero-knowledge proofs, which Sandy mentioned, secure collaboration, public ledgers, and so on and so forth. And as I said, this has had a lot of, even though it was invented by theoreticians and mathematicians, it's had a major impact on the world in terms of cryptocurrencies, the ability to shop online safely, and so forth, cloud computing. But for this talk, I'd like to zoom out from these approach of just thinking about this as a bunch of tools that are useful and think about it more generally, that all of these tools, essentially what they do is enable us, the users, to trust technology. Okay, so the technology might be the internet, remote communication, cloud computing. It enables us to trust it and use it as if there are no adversaries present, even though we know that there are people listening online. There might be people who are trying to pretend to be us. There might be break-ins to cloud computing and so forth. Okay, so altogether, all of this package of cryptographic protocols is a way to enable us to just use technology and be completely ignorant of what's going on underneath and be able to trust it. And this has been going on since the story of modern cryptography since about the mid-70s, so much so that we have a recipe at this point, a recipe or a set of principles for how to build trust in technology. So the recipe book essentially works as follows. We usually have a task, might be private communication or something else. And first step in this recipe book is that we define it precisely as a mathematical goal. Then the second step, which perhaps possibly even more important, is that we give a mathematical model of an adversary. That is, what are the capability of the adversary who is trying to disturb the task? Then we define a security of a solution. What is a good enough security? So it's usually not perfect. It's not exactly as if the adversary wasn't present, but it's good enough. And then we build a primitive, and it's extremely important is that together with a primitive within my field, we provide a proof, mathematical proof that usually takes the following form. It says, this primitive is secure according to the definition we gave. So it's a good enough security in the presence of the adversary we define. So there's usually a condition, some assumption holds. What are the type of assumptions that we use in cryptography? We might assume that there's a certain computational problem, which is so hard that all computers present today and in the future will not be able to solve it quickly enough so as to destroy the security of our primitive. Other type of assumptions are that there might be more than one person in the system. There might be multiple parties. And even though some of them may collude against the others, not everybody colludes. Sometimes we make physical assumptions. And that is that, let's say, parties are far enough apart so that they cannot communicate quickly enough. And sometimes we make assumptions that there are pieces of hardware that we trust. The important thing is that the security proof makes absolutely explicit and clear what the assumption is and shows a reduction between the assumption and the security of what the cryptographic protocol you propose. What this reduction means is that it's sort of a win-win situation. Either your primitive is secure, primitive, I mean the cryptographic protocol is secure, or the assumption fails. Why is that a win-win? Assumption fails means that you've managed to, in the case of the first assumption, solve some computational problem much faster than you thought before. So there's a win-win type of situation here. In any case, what we should retain from here is there's a recipe. We know how to do this as cryptographers. Every time we have a new problem, we go through this recipe and we provide a solution with a security proof. I want to highlight that in the context of cryptography, security proofs are extremely important. Why? Because if a cryptographic protocol fails, someone manages to attack it, they are not going to necessarily advertise it to the world. So the only assurance we have that something is not failing is that we've actually proved it to be secure. I want to also mention, so the picture here is in an adversary, that this adversarial modeling where we don't know what the strategy of the adversary is, and we must protect ourselves from all conceivable adversaries, is very important. I also want to mention is that sometimes you cannot establish trust. There are some adversaries and some tasks where trust will achieve. And in that case, we'd like to know that. So in fact, there are some body of cryptographic work which shows any construction will be insecure. Sometimes those proofs are also under assumption. They're saying, listen, if the following is a difficult problem, there's no way you're going to solve the task that you are interested in if there's such adversaries present. And then you need to either weaken your security notion or resort to other means. Okay, so why am I talking about this issue of trust? Because the issue of trust has been around in science and technology, sort of, right at the center of a debate for a while now. Can we trust scientific research, in the biological science and psychology? Can we trust images and sounds and pictures? Is it fake or real? And today, the entire conversation in 2023 is artificial intelligence trustworthy and safe? So when we talk about this in news articles, in blogs, in discussions in governments, should we use AI? Is it trustworthy? Is it safe? Often we don't even define it. So I get lots of emails in my inbox that talk about on one hand, we should not trust AI. On the other hand, we should use it because it gives you a competitive advantage. Very murky situation. If you look at this Hive display here, this is a bulletin board on the way from, I think, Berkeley to Stanford, where a company is advertising that they will tell you they can tell you the difference between what has been AI generated, hasn't been AI generated. There's now a lot of governmental debate about maybe putting in place some policies about when you can and cannot use AI and how you should do AI. The closest I've come to a definition this is from a website of a UK governmental agency, where they advise private companies to watch out when they use, let's say, a generative AI system like ChatGPT or Bard, to make sure that they're not using data that has been copyrighted or data that should be private, because they may get into trouble, since there are regulations that govern privacy, copyright rules. Right now, there still aren't very explicit regulations about the use of AI. Okay, so back to my main topic. We have machine learning, we have trust questions, and my proposal in this talk and in my current research is to use this cryptography recipe and maybe tools of cryptography, assumptions that we've used as cryptographers to address this trust problem in the machine learning context. So if we pull up the recipe, now instead of defining or specifying a cryptographic task, we will specify a machine learning task. So ML here stands for machine learning. We model an adversary. We define what's a good enough solution in the machine learning context. We build a trustworthy solution or show that it might be impossible to achieve trustworthy solution. And then we proceed with a proof. That is, under some set of assumptions, which is acceptable in the machine learning space, we prove that the solution is good enough. Okay, so I'm proposing to use this recipe that's been used extremely successfully by cryptographers in the machine learning space. Now, given that I'm a cryptographer, obviously I have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. What I'd like to convince you at the rest of this talk is that this approach is going to yield fruit and I think should be pursued heavily. All right. Some remarks before I show you examples of how we can use this recipe in the context of machine learning. In contrast of cryptography, machine learning AI was not originally designed for adversarial context. In other words, in cryptography, you want to communicate and you're worried about privacy. Obviously, that's when cryptography comes in. You are worried about an adversary who is trying to disturb your privacy. But AI, machine learning, has tremendous utility without even thinking about adversaries. It's not an integral part of the definition of the problem. Yet, AI systems are extremely attractive targets because of their amazing versatility and usefulness. And therefore, I argue that we must think about this adversarial modeling as the key to safe usage and composability of AI systems. And just like in the crypto setting, we cannot make any assumptions on how the adversary strategy proceeds. We need to prepare for the worst case. Having said that, we will consider computational limits on the adversary time. So we don't know what the strategy is, but it doesn't have infinite amount of time. It doesn't have exponential amount of time. It has reasonable amount of time, and we define that in some fashion using something terminology that's called polynomial time, but doesn't really matter for the purpose of this talk. So again, it's going to be a worst case adversary that has a limited amount of time, where limited is really all the time in the world, but in our world, not unlimited. Okay, so who are the adversaries in the machine learning pipeline? So the machine learning pipeline is very elaborate. I'm going to look at it in a sort of very simplistic way. I'm going to say there's during development, when we collect data and then we train the machine learning model on the data we collected. Then there's post-development, where somebody who may have developed the model gives it to me and say, hey, use it. And I'd like to verify properties of it. And finally, into the future, we have a machine learning model, maybe we verified its properties, and now we want to use it in the wild. When, let's say the machine learning model was trained on a bunch of patients, and now they're going to be patients in the future. Well, patients of the future may have different characteristics than patients that we collect the data on in the past. And we want to make sure that the machine learning model will be good enough to use on new test data, or at least on data that comes up in the future, or at least that we'll be alerted that the data that has come up is different from the data that we were trained on. Any questions? Or I guess we're going to keep that to the end. Okay, so this is the pipeline. What about the adversaries? Before I specify specific adversaries, I want to say that the machine learning field is divided into a lot of practice. There's amazing progress and some theory. I'm a theorist. The thing about adversaries in the machine learning pipeline is that adversaries apply both in theory and in practice. And definitions of what security we want apply both in theory and practice. And what I'm going to propose are methods which could apply do apply in theory and could apply in practice, and hope to convince you they do apply in practice. To go right ahead into it, I'll say that there's sort of two, we talk about algorithms in this space. Of course, I'm not going to dive into any specific of an algorithm, but by and large, we want to think of sort of two algorithms. One is a training algorithm. This thing takes data. I'm going to think of data as pairs X, Y, where X might be a patient's, if you think about a medical setting, it might be the records of a patient, and Y might be whether the patient is alive or dead, or Y may be what is the prediction for the patient's survival. And we're going to train an algorithm that that at the end of looking at all this data of the patients comes up with a new algorithm, which we call H, which is sort of an hypothesis. Okay, what is this hypothesis? Sometimes we call it hypothesis, some call it an inference. It's something that in the future only will get the X part and is able to produce, based on what it learned from the data, for a specific patient, say with record X, what is a prediction of whether they're going to live or die? What is the risk for developing further ailments? It might actually be a generative AI system, this H, and then it's not outputting a prediction or a risk score. It might be outputting a sequence, like, you ask it a prompt and then it answers something, or a distribution over sequences. So for those who are not experts in AI here, there are two stages in AI. There's a training where you take a lot of data, and from that you learn an algorithm. And the second stage is you take that learned algorithm H, and now you ask it to either give you predictions or generate answers to prompts, and so forth. The goal usually when you train an algorithm is that this is going to be a good algorithm. In other words, when you give X, it's going to give over here, you're going to get a good Y back. More explicitly, when we talk about this mathematically, the goal is to sort of minimize some sort of error or loss, in the sense that we want to make sure that somehow that our training, or the thing that we came up with, this H, is so good that it could predict really the correct Y on most X's. Okay, so let's talk about adversaries. So what about training time? Who might be the adversaries at the training time that we have to worry about so that we want to develop trustworthy solutions? So training requires massive amounts of data. One thing that's very clear is that so far we need a ton of data to make progress in AI. There's a big argument by a lot of AI specialists about, is it the data that really is where the secret sauce is, or is it the algorithm? I think the verdict is still out, but as far as we know now, regardless of whether the algorithm is important or not, we need a lot of data. Where does the data come from? The data is often held by different parties, not necessarily by one party. Later on, I'll talk about a setting in a medical setting where it's very clear that data is not held by one hospital. It might be by multiple hospitals, by multiple countries. And once that's the case, the following adversaries come to mind. What if, on one hand, the server, the trainer, is adversarial? And why should all these different hospitals or different banks or different holders of data trust that when they give their data to the trainer, okay, the one who's going to take all the data, do the training algorithm, come up with an H, they're going to respect their privacy? Can we actually keep the privacy of the data that we are going to use for training and still train? Another question you could ask is, why would we trust the robustness of the model for unforeseen inputs? I'll talk about robustness a little bit later. Robustness, in a word, means that perhaps now they're going to train an algorithm, they're going to give it to me, but perhaps this algorithm works for most X's, but there are some X's that have been singled out where the algorithm is not going to work. You want to make sure that's not the case. Another type of adversary may be not the trainer, but maybe the data owners themselves are adversarial. Maybe when you are providing data, some of the data providers say, listen, I'm going to give you my data, but I'm going to poison some of the entries because I want to make sure that later on this H or algorithm that you develop is going to work to my advantage. So you see, there are two different adversaries here. One adversary might be the data holders or giving you the data. Another adversary might be the trainer who takes the data and is curious about your particular X and Y, in addition to providing you at the end an algorithm. Okay, to be more clear, let's dive in. So let's look at the case where we don't trust the trainer. So in other words, we are not worried right now about the data, but we are worried about the trainer. And the first thing I'm going to look at is privacy. I think Sandy talked about privacy, so it's appropriate to start with privacy. So what is the task here? The task here is that I would like to, remember that picture where there was, on the left, there were these X and Ys, and they were coming in from lots of sources, and some entity was now running a training algorithm on this inputs. So the output of that would be some algorithm H, which is a model that will be later used to, given X, come up with Y. And our task is to do this privately. Now, the adversary, the trainer, let's for a minute think that they're going to do everything like they're supposed to, but they're extremely curious. So they're going to look at your particular medical record, if X is a medical record, and your Y, and keep it for other purposes except for training. And what would be a solution to ensure that they cannot do it? One definition of a solution that's good enough is we want to make sure that at the end, whoever the trainer is cannot learn more about these X and Ys than what they need to, namely than H. So can you do that? Can you actually use these X, Ys without looking at them, without learning something about individual X and Ys, but just figuring out from them what H should be. So there's been many, many works on this, starting from about 2012. They started from sort of feasible, so saying, yes, in principle, you can do it, and on paper. Then there are proofs of concepts. They use a lot of tools that we've developed in cryptography, like secret sharing, private, multi-party secure computation, homomorphic encryption, many things we have developed since the 80s for cryptographic purposes. And the problem is with all of these solutions is scale. So when you want to train in scale, namely lots of X's and Y's, not just a few hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, then these solutions, by and large, are very, very slow. Okay? Still, I'd like to first of all, tell you a little bit what solutions like this look like, very broad strokes, and then tell you that there's some medical applications where these things work well for large numbers, and I believe are useful today, not only sort of on paper, but for real data of real patients in hospitals. Okay, so what does privacy in training, by and large, looks like? First solution that I'll describe to you uses something called homomorphic encryption. In a minute, I'll say a word more about what that means. So what happens here, whereas before we had these X and Ys, and they were given to the training algorithm, or which maybe is controlled by an adversary who was very curious about X and Y. Now, instead of giving X and Y in the clear, we were going to encrypt X and Y. So each user or each hospital encrypts all their records and gives all this encrypted records to some trainer who is very curious, and yet we will show the ability to run whatever training algorithm this trainer has on encrypted data without decrypting, so that at the end, he does all of this on encrypted data, and at the end, the output is an encrypted model H. What's the use of an encrypted model H? We need H to use in the future to be able to take a medical record and predict the risk score for someone's survival. Well, we need now to decrypt this encrypted model, and for that, we will have the following decrypt stage. There's an encrypted computation happens here, and then there's a decrypt stage of the model. This decrypt stage, you don't want to apply it to individual records, you just want to apply it to the model. And the way that's done is that there are these servers, okay, who have shares. This is sort of pictorially, but this means something algorithmically. Shares of a key that enables them, if they all collaborate and each one uses their share on this encrypted H, to decrypt it. So we have two stages. Everything comes in encrypted, everything is run under encryption, and then there's a final decryption stage. So I told you that there's a recipe, and the recipe says, under some assumption, a solution works. Here I propose a solution, but what are the assumptions? The assumptions are essentially that you have a way to do what's called homomorphic encryption, which is secure. In a second, I'll tell you what is homomorphic secure encryption and what is the assumption under which it's secure. It's called learning with errors. It's some kind of mathematical problem. Plus, another assumption is that these three key shareholders do not collude to reconstruct a key and then go and decrypt these individual records. So there are two assumptions here. One is you have a good encryption scheme, and that is reduced to some simple mathematical assumption. There's a big construction that you could show as equivalent to the fact that some problem is difficult, which we believe. And second is that there are these key holders who don't just get together and reshare the key and just betray the whole trust. So who are these key holders? It depends on the context. In a hospital, it might be two hospitals who are working together. It could be two governments. It could be several banks who don't really want to reveal to each other their shares of the key, but are interested in figuring out this model H and will collaborate for those purposes alone. All right. So I said I'll say something about homomorphic encryption. What is homomorphic encryption? Forget about all these details. Let's just look at the picture here. Homomorphic encryption allows you to do the following. A client, which in what I've been talking about, I've been using the example of a hospital, might be a hospital that has private data, encrypts it. Then he sends all these encrypted data to something that we call it a server or cloud, where there's some evaluation that happens without decrypting. the output of the computation or this evaluation is encrypted itself, and then there's a decrypt stage. So in what I've shown you, the client private data are these X and Y's, which you encrypt. The evaluation is running the training algorithm, coming up with an encrypted H, and then there's the decrypt stage. The beauty of homomorphic encryption is that this is possible. It shows you how, without decrypting first, you can compute everything under encryption. And it's expressive, it supports arbitrary computations, and it's compact. So the encryption of the client's records are not very large, and they're not proportional to the size of the computation, which might be very complex. Now, this is a little mathematical, so it's for those of you who have some propensity, and the others can just shut their eyes for a minute. I said that the assumption is something called learning with errors. Essentially, the assumption is that there is a system of equations in some unknowns, these S's, and you have the coefficients for the equations, you have the solutions on the right-hand side. These are sort of in a finite field. The point is that usually if we have a system of equations, we know how to solve it. This is linear algebra. In this case, these are going to be noisy equations. So you don't really have the right solution on the right-hand side. You have some noise. Turns out that once you have noisy equations for the right distribution of noise, this is a very difficult problem, not only classically, but also for quantum computers. So it possesses what we call post-quantum security. The best known algorithm to solve this problem is exponential time, even for quantum computers. Okay, this was one solution concept for privacy during training. There's one more solution concept I want to describe because it's used all over the place, and that is the following. Instead of encrypting these X and Y's, as I proposed in the previous solution, there's something called secret sharing, where each one of these X and Y's is, you can think of it as a secret, and you are able to sort of break X into two pieces, which we call secret shares. And then you have two compute servers. You give one share of the secret X, say, to compute server 1, another share to compute server 2. And there's a method that was developed in the 80s first paper is by Andy Yao, called garbled circuits, and a lot of progress since then, which enables you to run any algorithm, and in specific the training algorithm, on the shares. So each one of these servers, they have their shares, they do some computation. This guy does some computation on the shares. Using a share alone tells you nothing about the secret X. Once in a while, you have to interact, but you interact in such a way that, again, you do not reveal your shares. And at the end, you both possess shares of the output H. You give to each other the shares, and you reconstruct H from the shares. So again, you have instead of an encrypted stage, you have a two-party secure computation stage, and then you have a reconstruction stage. Interestingly, even though these are two different solutions, the assumptions you need to prove security of this solution are exactly the same as the assumptions that you needed for homomorphic encryption. That is, that these two servers don't collude, and then there's some mathematical assumption, which again is essentially this learning with error problem is difficult. So what is the challenge? I told you there is a way to solve it. There are two even ways to solve it. One challenge is scale. So if we think about scale, usually you can map it on 3 axes. First, the computation that you're doing. If it's a linear time computation, usually we can do it. No problem, training at scale. We can actually do pretty well on logistic regression type computations. Once you get to neural nets, deep neural nets, scale kills you. Once you get to large language models, forget about it. So what happens these days, you try to address more and more computations, which are more and more complex, and do it efficiently, addressing the issue of scale at the training time. By the way, inference time is much easier. Another axis is the adversary. Who is the adversary? What kind of power do they have? Are they really just honest but curious? Are they malicious? And the third axis is the assumption. I've told you about assumptions like that certain problem is hard, like this learning with errors or factoring integers. I've also talked about no collusion. Another assumption that's sort of a big player these days is trusted hardware. Because computational hardness, no collusion, these are wonderful assumptions that I trust completely, okay? But so far, they can address linear computations, logistic, maybe low-level neural nets, but not deep neural nets. So trusted hardware is something that people are looking at extremely seriously today in order to speed up computation, secure computation at scale. When we say trusted hardware, what do we mean? Again, so there has been something by Intel. So it has been around since 2015 called Intel SGX. These days, people talk about something called H100 by NVIDIA, which is confidential computing hardware that they have announced in 2023. The idea there is the following. They say, I'm going to give you a chip, okay, or a GPU, such that just put your data in, these XYs, if you will, encrypt it in. And inside of the chip, there's hardware that decrypts the encryption, does all the computation, and gives you back the result. And there's even another module where they will prove to you that the result is correct. So it sounds wonderful because, in a sense, it's all done on hardware. It's quick. It uses GPUs. It has high performance. What is the problem? The problem is all your trust is in the chip. Or it's not that you don't trust NVIDIA or you don't trust Intel that would like to provide you with security. The fact is that so far, NVIDIA hasn't, the GPU H100 hasn't been under scrutiny yet. But since the Intel SGX has been out since 2015, there has been a lot of research showing that there are what's called side channel attacks that are able to break the security of these chips. In the following sense is that they can really even uncover the decryption keys. So why? Because the hardware can be put under scrutiny. That has something to do with power supply and many other cache attacks. Multiple people use the hardware. Some trace of previous computation stays around. And in general, my message is that hardware seems to be a fabulous solution, but should not be trusted blindly, has to be subject to a lot of scrutiny. I want to jump to talk about a setting where this is not so abstract. So the setting is the setting of genome-wide association studies. So you have a lot of patients, they have genomic profiles, and they have profiles of diseases. And GWAS finds essentially association between genetic traits and illnesses. The thing about the genomic profile is we know that is much more revealing than anything you can think of, even if you anonymize it. So just having your genetic sequence because of your proximity to your relatives, say your relatives have their sequence being sequenced by 23andMe, it is revealing by itself of who you are. And yet, this is a setting where if we don't have a lot of data, we get no signal. This is true for breast cancer, for schizophrenia, for Crohn's disease. You need really thousands and thousands of genomic sequences and illnesses data in order to make any progress with GWAS. So we have a place where privacy is important, but you need scale. So how are you going to do this training of GWAS, say, using achieving privacy? So one possible thing is you can do anonymization, but that's pointless again, because the data itself is revealing. So because this is such an important application, there's been a sequence of papers on it. I think the first paper was a group at MIT by Bonnie Berger and et al., where they proposed to use the solution of two-party computation, doing secure two-party, like that was the second solution I outlined. In this work, they predicted that homomorphic encryption is going to take, each computation will take 10 years or something like that. Of course, then we came up with a paper showing how to do the same thing on the same data sets using homomorphic encryption. This is with my co-authors here, Marcel Blatt, Gusev, and Polikako, and we show how to do this faster than the two-party computation. This goes back and forth. This is where it really shows that competition in science is actually a wonderful thing. As you see, this is where they have these two-party collaborating, non-collaborating servers, we have the solution where you encrypt your files and do everything on their homomorphic encryption. The advantage here is that there's no need for a lot of interaction. The interaction is only in the end when you want to decrypt the result. Moving forward, there's a new paper that I'm a part of. It was actually pioneered by a company that I co-founded on genome-wide association, on homomorphic encryption and analytics called Duality. What's different here is that we don't do GWAS. We actually go to a hospital, to an oncological unit, and use real patient data. I think the number of patients that were participants were 623 patients with 24 variables, sort of 15,000 data items. And what we would do here is we show how to do how to do a list of computations, mean, median, standard deviation, survival analysis, logistic regression over encrypted versions of patients' data. What's new about this is we use real patient data rather than these sets that people use just to test their methods. 2, we actually do a combination of homomorphic encryption and multi-party computation. We use as a basis for our homomorphic encryption a system developed by Chin, Kim, and Song. This is from 4 Korean researchers whose system is efficient for real number arithmetic and machine learning. And we make it, of course, better for this application. We have to fine-tune it for it. And one of the most important features of this new work is that we allow join operations. What does it mean, join? Usually in the previous works, the patients are, there's a lot of patients that come from different hospitals, but their records look, in some sense, the same. Whereas if you think about real-world data, the same patient might have hospital records in one hospital, blood test records in some laboratory, maybe prescription medicine from a CVS. So real-world data doesn't look as clean as having essentially all genomes of patients in the same format. In which case, the only thing that's common among different records is the patient's name. And a join operation essentially might have the same patient ID, but very different types of data, which is the way that the real world data looks like. And what we allow in this work is to do join operation under encryption. Again, if the data was anonymized, you couldn't do that, because if it's anonymized, it means that you're not going to have an identifier. And therefore, join operations will be difficult or impossible to do. Okay, just want to say the medical applications are not the only applications that we address. Other applications are have been used elsewhere in, for example, in MIT, there is a platform that allows companies to combine their risk. So let's say companies get attacked. So there's some cyber attacks, but they don't want to tell the world that they've been attacked. They still would like to find out what attacks are coming. So they having a platform where they can report to each other the attacks without telling each other really that they have been attacked. And this allows this platform for these entities to share and learn about cyber attacks without disclosing their own sensitive data. Measuring financial risk in the UK, there's a group of UK law enforcement agencies and financial services that have built a consortium to detect and prevent financial fraud without disclosing the identity of fraud within their own institutions. We've talked here enough about privacy with the definition of security that I gave, but notice that it's not good enough. All I said is that you are allowed to learn H, but you can't learn private records. Maybe even H itself is revealing of private records. So people have added to this differential privacy, which means that even when you look, the guarantee that when you look at H itself, the inference algorithm, you have a guarantee that you will not be able to recover individual records, a very strong guarantee. You can't even tell whether the individual record participated in the training data. And there are a lot of work on differential privacy. So the ultimate solution really is to use both differential privacy and the methods that I've outlined together in order to be able to protect the encryption, the private records, and protect them in such a strong way where you wouldn't even know that they participated in the training algorithm. And there's lots of work on this. I won't get into it, obviously. I want to say one more type of adversarial attacks, and then I will finish and let people ask questions. So we've talked just about privacy. Are there other attacks? Obviously. And I want to mention one, which is attack of robustness. Okay, so I'll explain what I mean by robustness. What is the task? The task is I want to detect that this model that I got, this H, is really a good model. Forget about privacy for a minute. Somehow it got trained in a private way, possibly. And now I got this H and I'm looking at it. Somebody trained it for me. I want to make sure that this is a good H. What does it mean, a good H? I can, of course, test it on my own data, on some random X, and see that it gives the right Y. But what does it mean that it's robust? It means I want to make sure, okay, that I can detect that not only that on the XYs that I have, I can test it, but that this model doesn't deviate, okay, when the data is slightly perturbed, for example. So what am I assuming here? I'm assuming that I can't assume that the trainer really has run the training algorithm properly, because they may have some ulterior reason, goal to make it non-robust. Let's be concrete, okay? All right, so the situation is the following. There's a client, okay? There's a trainer. The client may even provide the trainer with data, and the trainer returns a machine learning model H to the client. So to be really concrete, let's think that we're not in the hospital anymore, we're in the bank. There's a bank, and this bank provides training data of loans. It says, here are people's records. This person, I should give him a loan. This person, I shouldn't give a loan. I shouldn't. Why shouldn't you? Maybe from their history, you know that they're not going to pay the loan back. They're going to default on the loan. And the bank, of course, doesn't have all the expertise and the computational power. They have the data of their past history. They give all their data to some trainer, and they say, could you train a model for me so that in the future, I can just put this, the client's record and find out whether I should give them a loan or not. So in this paper on planting undetectable backdoors in machine learning models, we show how the trainer could do something very devious that the bank cannot detect, that destroys the robustness of the model. So I think that by this example, you understand what I mean by the robustness and realize the danger ahead. So if the trainer was honest, they give you back some kind of a model, which when you give a loan, will tell you whether to give a loan description, the credentials of it will tell you whether to give the loan or not. But how about the following trainer? They decide that in the future they might want to get a loan, okay, or their family wants to get a loan. So what they do is they keep a backdoor, a key, okay, which changes the model they give you ever so slightly in the following way, that if a loan should actually be rejected, what this key enables them to do is to modify the application a tiny bit so that now, instead of being rejected, it will be accepted. So in other words, this should have been rejected. But you know that if you tell the model something a little bit different than what's really accurate, you have trained the model in such a way that it will accept what it should reject, approve a loan when it shouldn't. How bad is this? Can it really be done? What we show is it can be done. In fact, you can plant this kind of a backdoor in the model, which is undetectable. And essentially, you could take any loan X and make it perturb it slightly into a loan X prime, so the decision will be reversed. When I say it's undetectable, there's some kind of a mathematical meaning to that. Essentially, it says that under some cryptographic assumption, there is a way to plant a backdoor in any neural net, which will be undetected by any polynomial time algorithm with some sort of black box access. There's also, we can show that you can plant it in some neural nets, even when the bank could try to examine the model very carefully. What's interesting here is that in these constructions that we show, really the trainer will use the data you provided. They might even run the algorithm they're supposed to run. All they're going to do is change the randomness they use when they train the algorithm. Now, that's kind of bizarre. So it means that even playing with the randomness that the trainer uses can have disastrous effects on the robustness of the model that's being returned. So one of the takeaways here is that you should be aware of faulty randomness. Another takeaway is that a bank, a hospital, a cybersecurity agency should, when it gets a model that's been trained off premises, you should never assume that the model is robust. You should always attempt to do something like a post-processing stage. So you take the model, you don't have much expertise, but you should run something on top of it in order to sort of immunize it from these back doors. Turns out it's not so simple to immunize. We propose all kinds of post-processing ideas. We show some of them work, some of them don't work. I think we've spoken enough about what happens during development. What about post-development? Post-development, okay, so somebody developed, you may not trust them, you may not trust the data, but you run a verify stage. You should always try to verify. Another from the Berkeley to Stanford, there's another board of the same company says, we make AI work. Don't just trust us, test us, okay? Simpler said than done. How do you test a model? How do you verify a model? Can you verify properties and without retraining? Obviously, you can retrain, but you don't have the data, you don't have the time. You would like to verify using less samples, less quality data efficiently. Now, it turns out that there are some properties you can verify, and there are some properties we don't know how to verify. So the kind of properties I'm talking about is, what's the quality of the model? Is it robust? What kind of data was used on it? Does it adhere to regulations? And this is sort of my work these days. We can actually verify that the quality of the model, if the model is good or not with respect to a particular distributions of data. We cannot verify whether the model is robust. I think that's fairly clear from what I just showed you, because one can plant, for example, a backdoor which is undetectable. I want to say a word about this verifying the quality, and then I will end. In terms of verifying the quality, Sandy talked a little bit about zero-knowledge proofs, so mentioned in the word. There has been a lot of research going from theories in the 80s to blockchains in present day, using things called interactive proofs, zero-knowledge interactive proofs, non-interactive zero-knowledge proofs. The dream was, in the 80s, that a single reliable PC can monitor the operations of a herd of supercomputers with powerful but unreliable software and untested hardware. So the dream was that if you need very, very little simple computer, PC, that will monitor the herds, so that work that you need in order to verify will be so much simpler than the work that was needed to compute, right? So it's the PC that's, the picture is there's a simple computer, this verifier, who can, by interacting possibly with very complex a cloud or herd of computers, can verify that what they're giving them is correct. This dream that was started in the 80s and is now a reality on blockchains, unfortunately, does not apply to machine learning, because the case of machine learning is different. The input, first of all, is samples from a distribution rather than records of the past, let's say on blockchains. The compute is massively parallel and randomized, and the ground truth, actually, of, let's say that you're trying to verify that a transaction happened correctly, is not pre-specified because you're learning from the data. All this to say is that we need to do a lot more work. Some of it I'm doing. We need new definitions, new techniques. I think it's a fascinating area. Finally, I talked about during development that you need to worry about privacy and robustness. I talked about post-development that you need to do verification. What about the future? Suppose I've done everything wonderfully private, wonderfully robust as much as I can. I've verified properties, and then new data distributions come up. Data distributions we haven't seen. Maybe they're even controlled by a worst-case adversary. People often talk about this in the context of self-driving cars, that you've trained it on all kinds of settings, and then someone changes stop signs, changes the distribution of traffic. How are you going to make sure that you're going to be able to detect that in the future, that you'll be able to prevent these type of attacks? So I have some work on that. Again, adversarial modeling is key. You have to think that there's an adversary who may be coming up with these distributions in the future. And even if you can't work in the presence of an adversary, you should be able to at least detect that an adversary is present. So to detect the fact that you're looking at new distributions that are different than the way you have trained. And I have some work on that. My last slides are, most of the talk, in fact, all of it was about prediction and regression. What about this new elephant in the room, generative models, ChatGPT? What are the type of trust issues that come up there? So here's just a sequence of questions. It's my last slide. Challenges for the future. We want to verify the data sources, both because of copyright and because of hate speech and because of accuracy. We want to be able to distinguish fact from fiction for generated sequences and answers. We want to prevent and detect biases. We want to make sure that we can do water. We want to ensure plurality of opinions. We want to be able to do all this with black box methods. So because a lot of this, these language models, for example, are closed book, they're black box. Nobody's going to give us a source code. We want to be able to prevent and estimate like black swan events, unlikely but very bad events. And we want to be able to define regulation and propose methods to enforce them. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Professor Shafi. We can take one question. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
I can't hear it.
Professor Shafi, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. My name is Anna. I'm from TII in Abu Dhabi. I'm wondering about the following. You said about the backdoor attacks. Something is wrong with your screen.
Yeah, I know something very strange is happening here.
Oh, yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay. Yes, so you were speaking about the backdoor attacks and how a small change can lead suddenly to a loan being no longer rejected but approved. To me, it always seems that now with AI, we suddenly care about a lot of things which are the result of we didn't think it through. Like a human can easily do the same, right? If my friend works in the financial department of some bank, I mean, there are a lot of backdoor attacks nowadays, and with AI, we are much more sensitive to it. Like in general, we don't want any variation in decisions, which are nowadays varying all over the place, and we see it also reflected in AI that there's racism and there's biases and stereotypes. So it seems somehow we have to now solve a problem that only came about because we didn't also think our processes through before AI came up. So I just that's a thought I always have when AI models are under scrutiny.
Agree with you, but I think there's a difference here, and that is that there are a lot of regulations that tell banks how and processes in place that if somebody suspects, they might go and investigate the bank. What happens with AI, right? You're moving to this automated world where there's there's a sector of technology which understands them and controls them, and everybody else sort of like says, "Oh, very nice, I use it." And you can have a systematic way of bad behavior where we have no way to detect it. And I think that's where we got to be very careful. Whereas before there was legal methods to scrutinize, by sort of trusting technology without examining it, we are opening the door to widespread problems. Whereas before there might be somebody whose friend is in the bank and he just approved their loan. We are facing a much bigger, larger scale problem. And that's why I think it's very important to be able to first of all, detect these things, and then maybe have methods to verify them when it's not the case. Yeah.
So a big issue in the end is AI is not explainable, right? That it just makes a decision and it will not justify properly what happened in my, I mean, a human can justify the process often.
Explainability, exactly. Explainability is a big topic. There's actually going to be a semester on explainability in the fall in the Simons Institute. And I think it'll be, everything's online and streamed. So I think it's in a good, the whole issue of explainability and generalization is extremely important. But even if things were explainable, who tells you that they followed the protocol? That's what I'm saying is I'd like to be able to prove that.